Greetings, traveller of time. Let the sound of your daily life slowly fade as we slip into the heart of the 14th century, a moment in history when the sun seemed to hide and the earth hardened under an unforgiving cold. I am the old historian, keeper of medieval tales. If my stories bring you rest, then this voice has done its job. Now tell me, where does your listening echo from? We're standing just outside the village of Saint-Gilles in the Duchy of Burgundy, around the year 1315. Twilight stretches long, painting blue shadows across fields that should be fertile but lie under a stubborn crust of lingering frost. The heavy air of the coming night carries the damp smell of peat smoke and poorly burned wood, a scent that clings to clothes and settles into the soul, promising a sharper cold than daylight ever dared to show. Feel the rough wool coat that barely keeps your skin warm, and listen to the mournful creak of the miller's cart returning empty from town, a sound that mirrors the emptiness inside the barns. It is a time of forced quiet and tense waiting, where the wind whispering through dry branches seems to tell ancient stories of winters that never end. The cold had become more than a sensation. It was a constant presence, an invisible character rewriting everyone's life in those lands. The soil, packed tight by moisture and constant freeze, refused to yield the daily bread with its former generosity, and the murmurs in the taverns were no longer laughter, but desperate calculations of what little remained in the storage pits hidden beneath packed earth. Children, instead of playing in the spring mud that never arrived, huddled near stone hearths, watching the flames with eyes far too serious and grown for their age. Each crack of burning wood reminded them of a resource disappearing faster than anyone could replace it. The village, once alive with the clatter of artisans and the rhythm of blacksmiths, now seemed to swallow its own voice, and the only reliable sound was the bell of the Abbey of Cluny, marking the hours with a deep cadence that echoed the slow, relentless march of time and season. Now meet Brother Alban, a 23-year-old novice, recently arrived from a warmer region to the south, where his blue eyes still remembered brighter suns and lush vineyards, a painful contrast to the grey landscape now surrounding him. His job was simple. He was a scribe, but he'd also been tasked with recording the wonders of the weather, a list that grew heavier each week without any meaningful thaw. He spent his nights in the Abbey Library, a place that, even with a central hearth, held a stone-deep cold that reached straight into the bones. He handled parchment with gloves to protect both the ink and his numb fingers, feeling the coarse, chilled vellum beneath his touch. This quiet duty placed him at the center of change, watching the slow disaster unfold in elegant Latin lines. One of the curiosities Alban found in old manuscripts, now darkened with new meaning, was the bread tithe, an ancient monastic custom that required every 10th loaf baked to be given to the poor. It once ensured a minimal support network. Now, he saw its bitter irony. There were no 10 loaves to bake. Even with better reserves, the abbey struggled to feed its own monks, let alone the villagers who arrived at the door with broken dignity and thin, hollow faces. The familiar aroma of incense and beeswax in the chapel, once comforting, now felt like a futile luxury compared to the scent of despair rising from the village huts, a smell no devotion could drive away. Outside the abbey, life followed the rhythm of mutual survival, driven by the human stubbornness to resist nature's fury. Gauthier the farmer, a 40-year-old man of few words with hands cracked from working frozen ground, visited often, not to beg, but to exchange news and negotiate for seeds, even if planting seemed absurd. He was the link between monastic life and the brutal earth. He carried the strong smell of damp manure and frozen soil, a scent that, to Alban, was the very odor of harsh reality. Gauthier spoke of rivers freezing in strange ways, allowing dangerous crossings where there once were currents. and of snowfall that didn't isolate, but simply hid the few roots and tubers that might have saved his family from coming hunger. His wife, Margot, stayed home, weaving without pause. The rhythmic clack of the loom was the only thing breaking the heavy quiet inside their wattle and daub hut, a constant sound layered over the emptiness of hunger. She didn't weave for comfort, but for barter. Each rough piece of linen became a coin to be exchanged for a little barley or a strip of salted pork, anything to keep their young son from falling asleep with both cold and hunger biting at him. The cloth under her rough fingers felt cold and rustic, but in her mind she warmed it with a mother's urgency. The faint smoke from their chimney was one of the few Alban could still see rising. Tiny signals of life in a world that looked ready to give up. What we now call the Little Ice Age wasn't a single event, but a chain of bad years. Summers too cool, winters too long, an anomaly that reshaped European life. Its impact reached far past the simple shortage of food. Lack of sunlight and constant moisture encouraged rot in stored grain, making the little that remained often unsafe. Hopelessness grew from both physical scarcity and the creeping fear that the next harvest would also fail. The sense of powerlessness hung in the air like a cold fog, refusing to lift. Night after night, Alban recorded the dramatic decline in wine production, once a cornerstone of diet and trade. Burgundy's vineyards, a legacy of centuries, were being destroyed by the climate. Abandoned vines turned black and brittle, stretching toward an indifferent sky. This wasn't merely the loss of a drink, it was the collapse of an entire regional economy and the disappearance of vital calories. The silent wine cellars, once filled with the lively bubbling of fermentation, now echoed decline. Still, the abbey and the village held on to threads of solidarity, a delicate balance of need and charity that kept the community from collapsing. Abbot Frederick, an elderly, pragmatic man with a long white beard covering his chest, ordered that their honey and wax reserves, once meant for trade, be used to light extra candles in the church. Not only to brighten the space, but to warm it, even if just a little, and remind everyone that light could still push back against the prolonged dark. The warm softness of melted wax on Alban's fingers as he lit the lamps offered brief, sweet relief from the ever-present cold, a gentle reminder that nature, even in its harshness, still gave small gifts that could become hope. Gautier, in his own way, embodied medieval tenacity. He knew that beneath the ice lay the promise of life. Every day he walked the fields, searching for spots where frost was thinner, where a spade might break through the earth even a few inches. The sound of metal striking frozen ground was a rhythm of defiance, slow, stubborn, and unwilling to surrender. He carried a handful of frozen soil, feeling its gritty coldness, a sample of the obstacle to overcome, but also a reminder of the seed sleeping below, waiting for a miracle of warmth. Night air settled over Saint-Gilles with a deceptive calm. It was the silence of exhaustion, not peace. The few glowing windows scattered around the village were tiny pockets of resistance, and the smell of turnip stew, maybe with a precious bit of salted pork, was proof that the struggle continued one meal at a time. As Alban finished his writing, he looked toward the abbey window. The full moon hung like a disk of ice in the sky. He touched the cold glass with his forehead, a small shock that brought him back to reality. This wasn't just a winter story. It was a chronicle of human resilience during a slow-moving catastrophe, a time when people clung to hope the way moss clings to cold stone. His records were filled not only with numbers, but with human stories, neighbors sharing their last bundle of straw to warm their animals, and an old hermit descending from the mountains with dried mushrooms for the community, a small act of charity whispered from home to home. Alban wrote about the feel of the parchment under his fingers, so fragile compared to the harshness of life, yet capable of carrying memory for generations. His goal wasn't just to document suffering, it was to preserve the dignity and strength of those who refused to give in. Despite everything, Saint-Gilles held a stark beauty under the moonlight. Thatch roofs looked like small fortresses against the vast sky. The dry branches of the nearby forest clattered in the wind, creating a soft, rhythmic symphony that to an attentive listener like you might feel like nature's own lullaby, a simple, repetitive melody guiding you gently toward rest. A distant dog barked now and then, or a castle sentry shifted position, subtle reminders that vigilance and hope were still needed to reach the weak dawn light of the next day. Inside the abbey, the air held a dry, penetrating cold, different from the damp chill outside. Alban warmed himself through focus alone, knowing his work was an act of quiet resistance. He thought of Margot weaving, of Gautier studying the frozen soil, and how each person's strength was a thread in the tapestry of their community. The smell of ink and old parchment, sweet and earthy, was his comfort. The familiar weight of the lead inkwell anchored him, a small certainty against the vast, icy world beyond the stone walls. The year 1315 wasn't just a year of hunger. It marked a shift in social and economic structures. Crop failure forced nobles and landowners to open their stores or face revolt, nudging the balance of power in unexpected ways. Hunger acted as a brutal equalizer, reminding lord and serf alike that life depended on the earth, and when the earth failed, all were fragile. The silence of abandoned fields was a stark testimony of this new, dangerous reality settling across Europe. Young and observant, Alban saw poetry in the tenacity blooming amid chaos. He described candlelight as fallen stars refusing to die, and the miller's empty cart creaking as the earth itself sighing. These metaphors helped him cope with life's fragility, turning cold facts into a record that consoled and inspired. The smooth feather of his quill between his fingers felt like a voice of its own, a small bridge between him and the world he was trying to capture line by line. In one of Gautier's notes, scratched onto a bit of tree bark to save parchment, he wrote about the smell of old hay, a sweet nostalgic scent he kept for his donkey, the last working animal he owned. To him, that smell was the memory of abundant summers and the promise that such seasons might return. Alban recorded it, realizing how memory and the senses could become tools of survival, tiny mental shelters against the uncertainty of tomorrow. Night deepened, the cold sharpened, until every breath Alban took felt like it scraped his throat. He sensed the stiff chill of the chainmail beneath his habit, unexpected armor not against men, but against the relentless cold. He warmed his inkwell earlier, and the lingering heat helped keep the ink flowing, a small luxury. Outside, the wind hummed low against the abbey walls, a strange lullaby that lulled him into the relaxed alertness needed to finish his work. One historical detail fascinated him. In response to exceptionally cold, damp years, beer production rose sharply in some regions, since the grains used in brewing handled poor weather better than grapes or wheat. Beer became a safer source of hydration than frozen rivers and wells, and a more reliable source of calories. It wasn't just a dietary change, it reshaped local economies and habits. The faint scent of fermenting malt in the abbey stores had become a quiet symbol of adaptation and practical hope. Alban's pages filled with the sensory richness of a world in crisis, but not entirely broken. The soft glow of oil lamps, the smell of sweat and damp wool from those seeking help, the scrape of an iron hinge on the library door, the brief comfort of a sip of warm herbal tea. He tried to capture the duality of the time, the great hunger alongside the quiet beauty of large, silent snowflakes settling over everything, covering the world in temporary purity. This pairing of hardship and beauty was the heart of his chronicle. He imagined Saint-Gilles asleep, each small hearth a tiny beating heart resisting the cold. Every thin plume of smoke rising into the night sky was a sign of life. Silence, though unsettling, was also an invitation to reflect, to rest, and to trust the promise that life's cycles, though delayed, would eventually return with spring. As Alban ended his first session of writing, the tips of his fingers burned with cold, but his spirit held a quiet warmth from the story unfolding beneath his quill. The final image he held in his mind before going to bed was Abbot Frederick cutting the abbey's bread with the precision of a surgeon, making sure every person received the exact same portion. Leadership in those days wasn't about battlefield glory, but about fairness in scarcity, a silent gesture of justice and hope more powerful than any prayer. The soft, steady rhythm of the other monk's breathing was the last sound he heard, a gentle chorus cocooning him in the promise that, together, they could endure the long frozen night and welcome the faint morning light. And so, traveller, as the cold tightens its icy embrace around the village of Saint-Gilles and the lights go out one by one, I invite you to close your eyes and feel the coarse medieval wool and the sweet smell of old hay. Let the slow rhythm of survival rock you into a deep, restoring sleep. Let Alban and Gautier's resilience be your guide, reminding you that even in the harshest winters, the light of hope and community never fully goes out. It simply turns into small flames of resistance, waiting patiently for warmth to return. Your place is saved for the next part of this chronicle of an unforgettable winter, a tale of cold and hunger, weaving a new destiny for medieval Europe, waiting for you in the quiet space between now and then, in the comfort of well-earned rest. Night in the village of Saint-Gilles was punctuated by the sound of water freezing, a faint, sharp crack coming from collection barrels and nearby streams, a quiet rhythm of nature announcing that the ice was tightening its grip. Brother Alban, the scribe, felt that the cold wasn't just the absence of warmth, but a presence with its own texture, thin and cutting, clinging to his skin even beneath several layers of thick wool. He remembered the aroma of spices that once drifted in from trade routes to the east, a fragrance that now felt like a distant legend, replaced by the flat smell of damp wood and cold ashes hanging over the abbey and the village. That sensory shift, from rich fragrance to bare, muted air, was to him the clearest symbol of the crisis settling in, a season in which even the smells seemed to retreat and hide. The farmer's wife, Margot, and her work at the loom remained the beating heart of their hut, a quiet stubbornness standing against scarcity. She felt the rough linen under her fingers, cold and raw, and the steady sound of the loom's mechanism became, for her, a melody of stability, a refuge from the frightening stillness that had settled over the village since the last autumn harvest had failed. The smoke rising from her chimney, thinner and weaker than in years of plenty, was a visible prayer to the sky, a small cloud of warmth and effort that blended into the icy air. She watched it with the silent hope that this fragile ribbon of smoke would be enough to prove that life there still held on. Her husband, Gautier, kept the hard-headed resolve of someone who knew the earth's deepest secrets, even when it refused to respond. He devoted himself to a quietly widespread medieval practice, covering fields with thick layers of ash and manure to slightly raise the ground's temperature and protect it from deeper frost, a primitive kind of greenhouse built more on faith than science. He breathed in the strong, earthy smell of manure, a scent many would find unpleasant, but to Gautier it was the perfume of promise, the smell of life pushing through winter, a sensory hope planted directly into frozen soil. Abbot Frederick, a man with a calm face and patient hands, no longer saw his main task as solitary prayer, but as the practical management of hunger. He had imposed a strict food routine in the abbey, cutting portions and increasing the distribution of cereal and dried legume soups to the villagers, a measured act of charity meant to stretch everyone's survival as far as possible. The texture of his fingers, once used to parchment, had become strangely familiar with the roughness of grain sacks and the comforting warmth of wooden bowls handed to the poor, a tactile shift that mirrored the new focus of his monastic life. One of the cruelest and historically documented consequences of this extreme cold was the rise in the abandonment of children. Desperate parents who, unable to feed their sons and daughters, left them at the doors of churches and abbeys, hoping religious charity would give them a chance to live. Brother Alban recorded these events with a trembling hand, feeling the moral weight and deep sorrow in each small entry. He noticed the smell of sour milk and damp clothes from the babies wrapped in blankets at the gates, an odor of fragility that clashed with the harsh cold of the abbey's stone. Those tiny bodies were the most painful reminder of the quiet cruelty of this climate crisis. Gautier remembered the lively sounds of harvest festivals in better years, the loud laughter, the cheerful music of flutes and drums, a chorus now swallowed by snow and silence. In its place, there was only the muffled crunch of his own steps on frozen mud and Margot's low murmurs at the loom. To fight off despair, he sometimes hummed old planting songs under his breath, a slow, repetitive rhythm that was more a mantra of hope than a tune. Feeling the cold air vibrate in his chest, a small island of warmth and sound in a sea of ice and stillness. In his research, Alban had found descriptions of an old Roman custom, still practiced in some regions, storing seeds in jars sealed with wax and buried in dry, cold ground as a strategic reserve for times of scarcity. That historical detail had become an obsession for Gautier, who spent hours digging in random places, feeling the biting cold of the earth in his hands as he searched for a buried treasure of life, a small jar of barley or wheat that might have survived time and weather, an ancestral secret of survival. The texture of food had become a central subject in daily life. Salted and smoked meat, tough and fibrous, was rationed into thin slivers. Bread, made with poor quality grains, mixed with bran, and even sawdust in the most desperate cases, felt heavy and coarse in the mouth. Taste, once a path to pleasure, had turned into a simple record of survival. The feeling of a full stomach, even briefly and imperfectly, was the greatest luxury of that time. Abbot Frederick personally oversaw the cooking of huge pots of thick porridge, whose mild, warm smell had become the aroma of charity and stubborn hope. Margot noticed the change in the light slipping through the small oiled-skin window. In good years, the sun had entered bright and golden. Now it came in weak and bluish, stripped of warmth or promise. She felt the low temperature of the hut that never quite seemed to warm up, and nestled close to her loom and her child, using their shared body heat as a last line of defense. That subtle awareness of light and warmth was her way of measuring time, and the persistence of that cold, pale glow was a constant reminder that the natural cycle had been broken, forcing her to fight a winter that seemed to have forgotten when it was supposed to end. Alban reflected on the inevitable seasonal migrations beginning to unfold. Peasants and entire families abandoned their barren lands, walking toward larger cities or wealthier monasteries in search of food or work. He described in his records the sight of traveling groups, bent, dark silhouettes against a white and grey landscape, the soft, dragging sound of footsteps in the snow, the soundtrack of desperation. He felt the emotional chill radiating from those groups, a cold that wasn't just in the air, but in the spirit, seeping even through the abbey's stone walls. Another practice gaining strength in the shortage of grains, which Alban also documented, was the heavy consumption of dried legumes like peas and beans. They stored better and were more nutritious than inferior cereals. This shift in diet changed the smell of villages and monastic refectories, the air filled with the strong, earthy aroma of long-cooked stews, overshadowing the more delicate scents of the past. Alban felt the thick, grainy texture of those meals in his own mouth, a constant reminder that for everyone from the humblest peasant to the most devout monk, bare sustenance had become the center of life. In an act of practical wisdom, Abbot Frederick ordered the bells to be rung more often, at a slow, steady pace, not just to mark liturgical hours, but to give people an audible point of reference and a sense of order in a world slowly unraveling under climate chaos. The deep, resonant sound of the bell traveling through the frozen air carried for miles, a comforting rhythm acting like an invisible anchor for anxious minds, a sign that time still moved forward and that community and faith still stood. In his rare hours of rest, Gauthier would run his fingers over the worn wood of his plough, feeling the smooth, cold surface where his hands had gripped it so many times, a tool that had been his lifelong partner and now stood idle, waiting for a warmth that refused to come. He thought about how the excess rain and moisture of past summers had been just as devastating as the cold, rotting roots before they could ripen, a reminder that nature could be cruel in more than one way. The silence in his tiny workshop was broken only by the sound of his own breathing, slow and steady, quietly promising that life would continue. Margot tried to keep the fire going with the little wood Gauthier managed to bring home, tearing apart the remaining straw from their mattresses to coax the flames to life, a subtle, painful sacrifice. She felt the short-lived, precious warmth of the fire, a sharp contrast to the constant chill of the mud walls. To her, the flames weren't just heat. They were a living, comforting presence, and the smell of smoke and burning straw was the scent of safety, the only fragrance that truly mattered in such uncertain days. Alban wrote about the shrinking markets and regional fairs, once the economic and social heartbeat of Burgundy. With so little to sell or trade, whatever remained was priced beyond reach. The lively, chaotic sound of voices, animals, and bargaining had faded into a melancholy quiet in the village squares. To Alban, that silence was the most eloquent sound of economic collapse. He felt the thermal emptiness of those open spaces, the absence of human energy that used to fill them. One historical note, he added, was the growing use of wild roots and plants once ignored, like sorrel and nettles, to supplement the diet and prevent illness. Popular wisdom had suddenly become vital. He marveled at how life found ways to sustain itself even under the harshest conditions, and the strong, slightly bitter smell of these herbs, which Gauthier brought in, became the scent of adaptability and last chances. As Abbot Frederick walked through the abbey's corridors, he heard the soft, repetitive clicking of rosary beads in the hands of the monks, a steady rhythm that formed the spiritual backbone of the community. He felt the cold stone beneath his bare feet, a small act of penance he considered insignificant compared to the villagers' suffering. That physical discomfort was his way of sharing, in some faint measure, the hardness of life outside. The cool, worn beads slipping between his fingers reminded him, through touch alone, of his unwavering faith in a world slipping toward despair. At the end of the day, Gauthier would look up at the night sky, which in those cold years seemed clearer and wider, the stars burning with a bright, distant cruelty, a beautiful yet indifferent spectacle. He felt the temperature drop rapidly and went inside, imagining the stars as tiny, distant bonfires, hints of warmth that didn't belong to them. The hushed sound of snow falling, a soft, muffled whisper, became nature's lullaby, an invitation to sleep he accepted in sheer exhaustion. Alban ended that day's entries with a poetic image of Margot at her loom, her persistence a metaphor for medieval Europe itself, refusing to unravel under the pressure of cold and hunger. The feel of fresh ink on the parchment beneath his quill was smooth and soft, a comforting contrast to the roughness of the world outside. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of beeswax and parchment, an aroma of knowledge and resilience that wrapped him in a quiet cloak of calm and focus. This was life in St. Gilles, a fragile balance between survival and hope, a slow rhythm of endurance shaped by cold and mutual charity. Let the tenacity of Alban, Margot, and Gautier inspire you to find your own quiet place of calm, and let the gentle sounds of the Burgundian night guide you toward a deep, restorative sleep. The next turn of our chronicle is already waiting for you, ready to draw you deeper into the details of this time of trial and perseverance. Dawn over St. Gilles wasn't an explosion of light, but a slow brightening of grey, a gradual transition that brought no relief from the cold, only clearer visibility of the misery the darkness had briefly hidden. Brother Alban was getting ready to leave the abbey, a rare outing authorized by Abbot Frederick, so he could gather accurate information about the conditions in the neighbouring villages. He pulled on a heavy wool cloak and felt the damp, penetrating chill rising from the low fog, carrying the smell of moss and wet earth, natural, yet somehow infused with the weight of sickness and hunger. His main goal was to observe the trade routes and the idle mills, since the stillness of these vital points was the first key sign of the crisis. The flow of grain had almost completely stopped, turning simple scarcity into full economic paralysis. As he walked along the main road, the only sound he heard was the crunch of snow under his leather boots, and far off the uneven rhythm of a stubborn blacksmith's hammer, an intermittent signal that the production of tools, though minimal, hadn't completely ceased. He saw fields covered with a thin layer of ice that refused to melt, and the sight of that barren landscape tightened his chest, a kind of visual despair repeating itself with every step. The wooden staff he used for support felt cold and solid in his gloved hand, a constant object offering a small sense of security in a world steeped in uncertainty. What Alban saw was the physical face of the Great Famine that swept across Europe between 1315 and 1317, a historical fact he was trying to document in his notebook. The relentless combination of rain and cold during the growing seasons had been so harsh that the seeds Gautier and his neighbours planted simply rotted in the soaked ground before they had any chance to sprout, leading to 4 catastrophic harvest failures in a row. The air was so saturated with moisture that the smell of mould and decay was nearly constant, hanging over hay and straw reserves that were slowly breaking down, turning what was necessary into something useless, and weakening the few remaining animals even further. He crossed paths with Gautier the farmer, returning from a hunting post in the forest with empty hands and a face dusted with soot and frost. Gautier explained that wild game, their last real source of protein, was now scarce and elusive, forced to migrate or die under the same cold that was crushing human life. He smelled of oak smoke and cold sweat, an odor of effort that led nowhere. He rested a rough, heavy hand on Alban's shoulder, a small gesture of shared understanding of how serious things had become. Hope had turned into an endless search for anything that could be swallowed, and Gautier's silence carried a quiet mystery of pain and resignation. Alban felt the tips of his own fingers go numb inside his gloves, a constant reminder of how hostile the environment truly was. He allowed himself one small sensory luxury, closing his eyes for a moment and breathing in the faint scent of lavender coming from a little amulet Margot had given him, a gift meant to bring luck and chase away sorrow. A brief hint of summer in the middle of the dominant smells of winter and misery. The tiny object was cold to the touch, but warm in meaning, a gentle counterpoint to the hardness around him. He eventually reached the Valley Mill, a stone building that had once echoed with the lively sound of turning paddles and rushing water, now completely silent and still. The wooden blades were covered with a thin layer of ice and dirty snow, a scene of desolation that served as the clearest picture of collapse. Abbot Frederick had told him that the mill was the village's heartbeat, and now that pulse was faint. Alban ran his gloved fingers along the damp, icy stones and noticed that the once sweet, nourishing smell of flour had been replaced by the odor of stagnant water and rotting wood, the scent of quiet ruin. He sat down on a worn stone bench near the mill, the cold seeping through his habit. Opening his notebook, he wrote about the historical importance of water mills in the Middle Ages, how they'd been a crucial technological leap, saving human labor and allowing the grinding of large quantities of grain. Now, with the harvests failing, that same technology stood useless, revealing how dependent medieval society really was on the weather, no matter what advances it had made. The silence inside the mill was unsettling. He described it as a sonorous emptiness, an absence that spoke louder than any machine noise, echoing the hunger spreading through the land. The weak daylight revealed the pale colors of the landscape, the dirty white of the snow, the dark brown of wet earth, the leaden grey of the sky, a dull palette that mirrored the region's heavy mood. Trained in observation, Alban noticed the smallest details, a bird's nest abandoned high in an oak tree, the thin, brittle texture of ice on puddles, and the slow, fragile curls of smoke rising from the farthest village chimneys. This careful attention to what he saw was his way of staying connected to life, even when that life was defined by deprivation. He thought of Margot at her loom and how the mill's stillness contrasted with the steady rhythm of her weaving, a quiet sound of human persistence pushing back against nature's inertia. The smell of fresh linen, which he associated with her work, was a scent of hope, a promise that individual effort could still create something of value and be traded for food. The hollow discomfort in his own empty stomach reminded him that his job, though intellectual, was deeply tied to the daily struggle for survival. Alban's journey was also a search for movement during a time of stagnation. The silent mill stood as a symbol of interrupted flow, and he couldn't help wondering how the community would ever find its rhythm again. As he watched the river's water slide slowly beneath a thin crust of ice, he saw a hidden current, a submerged, invisible motion that felt like a quiet mystery, a sign that life and movement still existed beneath the surface. They were simply waiting for the right moment to break through and shatter the ice that held them back. As Brother Alban approached the riverbed, he noticed a small wooden bridge covered in damp, slippery moss, and felt the treacherous texture of the planks beneath his feet. There, he found the last person he expected to see so far from the village, Abbot Frederick himself. The abbot stood quietly, watching the slow current, and his usually serene expression carried a shadow of worry. Frederick told him he had ordered part of the river ice to be broken in a specific section, an exhausting manual intervention meant to keep a smaller mill downstream turning for at least a few hours each day. This was pragmatic leadership at its core, turning despair into small, concrete action. The sound of axes and mallets breaking through the thick ice was an unusual rhythm of forced labor in the winter silence, at once violent and vital. Alban felt the faint, almost physical warmth of hope radiating from that effort, a small but noticeable heat born from Frederick's determination. The scent of freshly cut wood and shattered ice lingered in the air, a fragrance of human effort pushing against the stagnant smell of the frozen landscape. Abbot Frederick explained that keeping even one mill running was crucial for morale, since the act of turning grain into flour was an ancient symbol of life and civilization. He mentioned to Alban the difficulty of protecting their small grain supply from rats and insects, a historical reminder that the war against pests was as constant as the struggle against the weather. The rough, chilled texture of the iron tools used to break the ice was a tactile reminder of the workers' hardships, repetitive, exhausting labor carried out with numb hands and stubborn persistence. Alban continued writing, noting down the architecture of the region's bridges, their wide pillars and solid foundations built to withstand spring floods that, in good years, were feared, but now felt like nothing more than a distant myth. He ran his fingers across the cold, wet stones supporting the bridge, imagining the force of the water that should have been flowing there. The absence of that lively, rushing sound was its own soft mystery. The quiet trickle of water moving underneath the ice felt like a whisper, a promise of movement that refused to fully fall silent. The monk then headed toward the forest, where he hoped to find Gautier again and learn more about the hunting and gathering techniques the farmer relied on. He thought of Margot and how the quiet, invisible work done inside the home, spinning, weaving, mending, formed a vital foundation of medieval domestic life. He felt her faint, earthy sweet scent on the little amulet tucked inside his notes, a fragrance that pushed him to record the importance of every effort, no matter how small. As he stepped onto the forest's edge, Alban noticed the shift in sound. The strong wind was softened by the evergreen trees, and the silence was broken only by the cheerful call of a stubborn blackbird, a bright, unexpected sound that added a gentle contrast to the darker tone of the day. The temperature changed slightly too. The air beneath the trees was drier and less biting, offering brief relief from the damp cold of the open fields. He found Gautier collecting dry branches for firewood, working at a slow, deliberate pace. Gautier explained the custom of gleaning, the medieval rite that allowed the poorest peasants to gather what was left in the fields after the Lord had taken his share, a rite that now held little meaning since there were no leftovers. He felt the brittle, rough texture of dry branches in his hands, poverty in tactile form, and the scent of pine and moss clung to him like the fragrance of perseverance itself. Gautier then shared a small, human story from his day. He had discovered a nest of quail eggs, tiny and fragile, and left them untouched despite his hunger. An investment in the future, a quiet hope that wildlife might survive long enough to multiply again. Alban watched the farmer step away from the nest with careful silence, a gesture of reverence toward life, and immediately wrote it down. Leaning against an oak tree, Alban felt the coarse texture of its bark beneath his gloves as he looked up at the faint sunlight struggling through the canopy. He reflected on the subtle difference between the cold of stone and the cold of wood. Stone was merciless, while wood held the memory of past warmth. These reflections on texture and temperature helped him stay calm within the bleak landscape, searching for small traces of poetry in the harshness of the century. He asked Gautier about the soil quality in the forest, and the farmer explained that woodland earth was more acidic and poor for crops, but the layer of decaying leaves protected wild roots, allowing some edible plants to survive. It was a contextual detail of medieval agriculture, The contrast between the fertility of open fields and the resilience of the forest's hidden ecosystem. The strong, sweet smell of decomposing leaves was the scent of hidden fertility, a perfume of slow, underground hope. The forest's color was a deep, persistent green from the pines, a visual relief from the gray and brown fields. Alban noticed the soft, fine texture of fallen needles beneath his feet, a natural carpet, absorbing the sound of his steps. The gentle rhythm of that environment invited contemplation. Alban also noticed a small scar on Gautier's hand, a reminder of a work accident. The farmer explained it came from a plough hook, an iron tool that in the freezing weather broke more easily. It was a small human story about the fragility of tools and bodies in extreme temperatures, and Alban recorded it as a sign of the constant struggle against material decay. He reflected on how the crisis had intensified both faith and superstition. The soft murmur of rosaries being prayed in homes and the strong smell of burning sulfur used in protective rituals coexisted, showing the dual strategies people relied on: institutional devotion and old folk rites. Alban felt the temperature of faith, a warmth for the soul, standing in contrast to the real cold that froze the body. He said goodbye to Gautier with a rough, cold handshake and started back toward the abbey with a new perspective. The gentle mystery of that scene, a peasant family resisting through small acts of stubbornness, became his motivation. He heard the repetitive tolling of Abbot Frédéric's bell, a steady rhythm guiding him home, a sonic anchor in the middle of disorder. The last ray of the day, weak and orange, touched the abbey tower, a fleeting glimpse of hope. Alban smelled the sweet, comforting aroma of cereal soup waiting for him in the refectory, a scent of nourishment and care. He touched the parchment tucked in his cloak, feeling its smooth, cool texture, knowing he had captured yet another day in the long story of human resilience. Abbot Frédéric greeted him with a calm smile and a look filled with gratitude for his diligence. Alban stepped into the abbey, the soft sound of the wooden door closing behind him, sealing out the cold. He felt the dry warmth inside, an immediate and welcome comfort, a sensory contrast that defined the very idea of refuge. And he knew that the chronicle he was writing wasn't really about the cold itself, but about the invisible strength holding people together through hardship, a strength woven into every thread Margot spun, every branch Gautier gathered, and every choice Abbot Frédéric made. Life continued at a slow, steady rhythm. The bell of the Abbey of Cluny rang for matins, its deep, heavy sound drifting over the village of Saint-Gilles with deliberate slowness. Brother Alban was back in his cell, wrapped in the darkness of the cold dawn, feeling the damp chill of the air even before daybreak, a cold that carried the faint, persistent scent of wet stone and extinguished ashes. He was deepening his observation of the central element, how the lack of sunlight and warmth, a gradual, relentless drop in temperature, had begun to affect the quality and distribution of essential goods. Alban reflected on the feudal storage system, a crucial historical fact of the period. The lords' granaries, which were supposed to sustain the entire community, had become places of growing tension. The rough texture of old wheat, meant to last for years, now felt moist and compromised, giving off a sour smell of decay that not even the grainmaster's vigilance could fully hide. Abbot Frédéric had already told Alban that pressure to open those stores was increasing, and the noble's hesitation was turning scarcity into social resentment, a slow fire smouldering beneath the ice. The monk documented a small story from Margot, the weaver, who had found an ingenious way to gather more calories for her family. She no longer traded her linen for simple barley, but for turnip oil, a substitute for the scarce olive oil, and small pieces of animal tallow that, though repulsive to the wealthy, were vital sources of fat and energy. The strong, rancid smell of tallow was the perfume of survival, an aroma that Margot valued dearly. The steady rhythm of her loom, slow and descriptive, acted as her metronome against the chaos of hunger. The texture of the fabric she produced had changed as well. Fine linen, a summer luxury, had been replaced by thick, heavy twill, a cloth cold to the touch in its raw state, yet offering better insulation under layers. Alban felt the roughness of this new fabric, a tactile reminder of austerity, but also of resilience. Its dark, undyed brown color reflected the absence of resources for dyes. In his practical wisdom, Abbot Frederick had instructed Alban to observe the people's health, because malnutrition opened the door to disease. This was an important contextual note. Crop failure and hunger were factors that would later make the medieval population more vulnerable to the Black Death. Alban recorded the dry, persistent coughs he heard inside the villagers' homes, a sound of human fragility that contrasted sharply with the strength of the abbey's stone walls. He thought of Gautier, the peasant, and his stubborn attempts to sow even in winter. Gautier had begun using a winter sowing method, spreading hardier seeds across semi-frozen soil in the hope they would undergo a cold dormancy and sprout as soon as the weather allowed. The frozen ground beneath his hands was a physical reminder of the risk he was taking, but the scent of the earth was, for Gautier, a promise, a fragrance of the future. Alban watched the weak morning light filter into his cell and reflected on how the lack of sunlight affected not only the crops, but also people's moods and energy, leading to a widespread sense of slowness and apathy. He felt the chill of exhaustion settle over him, a cold that reached the soul, and forced himself to search for warmth in his writing, turning the landscape's sadness into words of quiet resilience. He began describing Frédéric's efforts to use wool from the abbey's own animals to weave blankets for the most vulnerable, a project that blended charity with pragmatism. The thick, warming texture of the wool, a gift from nature and creation, stood in tactile contrast to the coldness of stone and air. Its strong animal smell, unwashed and raw, was the scent of generosity. The soft, repetitive sound of his quill against parchment became his anchor as he wrote. He focused on describing the inner architecture of the village huts, thick wattle and daub walls, packed earth floors, thatched roofs, structures that trapped only the faintest heat and carried the smell of peat smoke. This slow, poetic detailing was an invitation to contemplate the quiet resilience of these simple homes, built to endure but pushed to their limits by the unusual winter. He ended his meditation with the image of Gautier's hope, the seed hidden in the frozen soil. It was a metaphor for the story itself, life in its simplest form, waiting patiently for the chance to return. The slow, steady rhythm of his breathing became the sound of his own endurance. Still in the dim light of early dawn, Brother Alban felt the dry chill of the stone walls of his cell. As he focused on the subtle ways the cold reshaped the invisible economy of that era. He returned to a contextual detail Abbot Frederick had mentioned, the growing use of barter over silver and gold coins. With scarcity deepening, trust in minted money was fading, and tangible goods, Margot's linen, turnip oil, or even Gauthier's hours of labor, had become the true measure of value. The cold, heavy feel of an old iron weight on his desk served as a symbol of that financial instability. He recorded the small story of an elderly peasant woman, Ilara, Gautier's neighbor, who had traded her only family heirloom, a small amber brooch, for a sack of dried lentils, securing another week of food. The sound of the brooch dropping into Abbot Frederick's palm carried the melody of last hopes, a quiet, sorrowful rhythm that Alban tried to capture in the fluidity of his writing. The sweet, resinous scent of the amber, a fragrance from another time and another climate, contrasted poetically with the rustic smell of the lentils, the humble perfume of subsistence. In her cabin, Margot had adapted her loom to weave not only linen, but also nettle and rami fibers, plants hardier than flax. Although these produced a rougher, slightly prickling texture, they added durability and weight needed for trade. She felt the unusual harshness of these new threads against her fingers, a tactile imprint of hardship and ingenuity. The final fabric's grayish-green tone was the color of resignation and resilience, a muted variation in the somber palette of that winter. Brother Alban reflected on the importance of salt in that period, an essential historical detail growing rarer with disrupted trade routes and difficult extraction. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was crucial for preserving meat and fish. The mineral, almost metallic scent he noticed when passing the Abbey's kitchen felt like an aroma of luxury and preservation, one that was becoming increasingly rare. That scarcity was a quiet force, speeding the decay of the little food they had left. Gautier had returned to the forest, not to hunt, but to gather pine resin and pitch, materials he used to seal the cracks in his cabin and hold in whatever warmth the fire produced, a primitive form of insulation. The strong, penetrating smell of resin and pitch, an earthy woodland fragrance, was the perfume of his relentless effort. He felt the sticky, dark texture of the materials on his hands, a dirty but necessary touch for the survival of Margot and their child. Abbot Frederick continued to inspire the community with small gestures of serene contemplation. He ordered the chapel's windows, rarely opened in winter, to be scrubbed clean. The faint sunlight filtering through the washed glass created a momentary effect of clarity and purity inside the abbey, a reminder that subtle beauty still existed even under the season's weak light. Alban devoted himself to describing the abbey's supply logistics, a fascinating contextual detail. He wrote about the cold chamber, a small underground stone room where the temperature stayed low and steady, a perfect place to keep cheeses and root vegetables from spoiling. He felt the chamber's icy, damp air, a kind of cold that preserved rather than destroyed, and the earthy, dairy-rich smell of the stored food felt like the aroma of foresight and wisdom. He allowed himself a poetic metaphor, describing the slow, creeping advance of hunger as a fabric of ice, spreading thread by thread across the community's life. The only sound interrupting that metaphor was the soft creak of the wind brushing against the abbey tiles, a natural rhythm pressing against the warmth of his concentration. Alban touched his quill, feeling its fine, delicate texture, using it as a quiet weapon against the cold of forgetting. He wrote about the importance of the frozen marshes during that time. Though dangerous, they became temporary transport routes, allowing Gautier and the other peasants to travel with small wooden sleds to gather wood farther away. The muffled sound of sleds scraping across the ice and the vast, flat whiteness of the landscape created images of movement forced by scarcity, a sign that the crisis was shaping new, though risky, forms of connection and trade. Margot sometimes used a heated piece of iron from the hearth to press the thicker linen, a moment that offered her a brief, tactile warmth, a small comfort Alban recorded as an act of feminine dignity in harsh times. The faint hiss of the hot iron touching the damp cloth was a soft melody of work and care, an intimate rhythm of endurance. In his last conversation with Alban, Abbot Frederick had spoken about the changes in funeral customs. The frozen ground made traditional burials nearly impossible, forcing the community to wait for the thaw or rely on temporary methods. This grim historical detail was one of the clearest signs of how the cold had halted not only life, but even the rituals of death. Alban ended his writing with a serene reflection on Gautier's seed buried in the frozen soil. It was a poetic image of perseverance, a reminder that life, even in its most dormant form, waited patiently for the moment it could rise again. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of parchment and beeswax, an aroma of knowledge and resilience, and let the slow rhythm of his breath guide him toward rest. Brother Alban awoke to a different sound that morning, one that marked a turning point in his chronicle, the muffled rhythm of horse hooves striking hardened snow, a sign of movement that had long been absent from the village of Saint-Gilles. The shift in atmosphere was immediate, no longer the silence of stagnation, but the slow, deliberate arrival of a small group of travelers. The air felt drier, though no less cold, and the grey landscape was suddenly broken by the dark, fur-clad figures approaching, an unexpected visual impact that pulled his attention outward. The group was led by a woman, a travelling physician named Isabeau, rare, but not unheard of in that century. She brought no food, but something equally vital, remedies made from dried herbs and knowledge about the plague beginning to spread through the larger cities, a grim warning of what was coming. Her entourage carried an unfamiliar scent, strong and foreign, a mixture of leather, medicinal herbs, rue, sage, chamomile, and the smoky, ash-tinged smell of distant towns. It was an aroma that represented both illness and, ironically, the possibility of healing. Isabeau's arrival shifted the village's concerns, drawing them from the fear of silent hunger toward the fear of a disease that travelled with people. Abbot Frederick received her cautiously at the abbey gates, and the sound of reins being pulled tight became a tense rhythm of welcome. Alban studied Isabeau's face. Her skin had been marked by wind and cold, its rough, wind-burned texture telling the story of harsh travel, yet her eyes were clear and steady, a point of focus in a world filled with uncertainty. She carried with her a curiosity about the architecture of the time. She noted that newly rebuilt houses and storehouses in the cities, constructed after several great fires, had thicker stone walls and fewer window openings, an effort to retain warmth and seal in heat. It was a slow, adaptive shift in medieval construction, born from colder winters, and Alban recorded her comment as evidence that society was responding to the climate crisis in a physical, structural way. The sensory impact of the newcomers was immediate. The sharp snorts of horses in the cold air, the smell of sweat and fatigue clinging to Isabeau and her assistants, and the cold, heavy touch of the leather bags they carried, filled with glass vials and bundles of herbs. Movement brought life with it, but also risk, a metaphor for life in the Middle Ages itself. Alban noticed the dark, wet earth exposed beneath the snow where the horses had passed, a visual sign that life and mud still existed beneath the crust of ice. Gautier, the peasant, also came to observe from a distance, catching the scent of novelty and danger riding on the wind. For him, the arrival of outsiders always signaled changes in prices, shifts in the market, and the spread of news. He waited anxiously for word of thawing in other regions. His silence was cautious observation, and his hand rested lightly on the small axe at his belt, a reflexive gesture of protection against whatever unknowns this movement might bring. Alban noticed that Isabeau carried a simple measuring device, a modified clepsydra, a water clock used to time the boiling of her elixirs, a small human detail of science and practicality. The gentle, rhythmic dripping of water served as a sound of order in a world where nature's timing had fallen out of balance. She embodied this new perspective, a shift toward health and sanitation as tools of resistance against crisis. Isabeau described a custom used in larger cities, burning aromatic plants in large braziers at street crossings to purify the air, a belief rooted in the medieval fear of miasmas. It was a historical glimpse into early public hygiene and into the misunderstanding of what caused disease. The strong, penetrating smoke, an herbal tar-like mixture, was the scent of desperate hope. The meeting between Alban, Isabeau, and Abbot Frederick at the abbey gates created a quiet contrast, faith and practical medicine standing side by side against cold and illness. The abbot offered Isabeau a cup of warm wine, a rare luxury, and the comforting smell of cinnamon and heated wine became a temporary balm against the sharp cold of that morning, a small act of warming charity. When Dr. Isabeau visited the village homes, she eventually reached Margot, the weaver. The soft, rhythmic pulse of Margot's loom became the soundtrack of their conversation, and Isabeau praised the cleanliness of the cabin and the fresh smell of wood and clean smoke, a stark contrast to the filth of the larger cities. With her rough, strong hands, Margot traded a piece of her thick linen for a small dose of Isabeau's bitter tonic, a barter of calories for healing, a quiet transaction of trust in medicine. Brother Alban felt a new energy with Isabeau's arrival, a renewed sense of purpose that shifted his chronicle. What had once been a record of lack now began to include a record of searching and care. The wind, once a mournful howl, now seemed to carry Isabeau's voice outward, as though spreading the quiet news that help, however limited, had finally begun to move toward them. Isabeau's arrival brought a subtle contrast to the abbey's quiet routine, shifting its atmosphere with the sharp, penetrating scent of her medicinal preparations, a mix of alcohol and bitter herbs that competed with the familiar smell of incense and beeswax. Brother Alban devoted himself to recording the small story of how Isabeau was using the little honey abbot Frederick had set aside to make antiseptic poultices and cough syrups, a historically accurate detail, since honey was often used as both a preservative and a remedy because of its natural properties. The warm, sticky feel of honey on Isabeau's hands was a detail Alban captured with particular care in his chronicle. Alban watched Abbot Frederick and Isabeau speak, aware of the new perspective she brought. The crisis was no longer only about hunger, it was now a matter of public health. The link between famine and disease was becoming the central concern. The abbot discussed cleaning the wells and the importance of keeping water boiled, a medieval practice that took on new urgency during the prolonged winter. The soft, steady sound of water simmering in the abbey cauldrons became a quiet rhythm of prevention. Isabeau shared with Alban a curious custom she had seen in a northern town, keeping pigeons in attics and towers as an emergency source of protein, since the birds were easier to feed than livestock. It was a historical detail that showed how communities adapted their animal husbandry to scarcity. The gentle, continuous cooing of pigeons, she described, a modest rhythm of survival, stood in stark contrast to the silence of empty granaries. Brother Alban found himself reflecting on the difference between the abbey's static cold and the moving cold Isabeau faced. Her heavy fur cloak, rough and slightly oily to the touch, offered a warmth far superior to his own layers of wool. The sense of physical comfort those furs provided was a practical lesson in survival, one that monastic discipline never taught. Isabeau's presence stirred a quiet shift in the emotional landscape of Saint-Gilles. It wasn't hope for food, but hope for relief from pain and illness. Margot, the village weaver, began preparing sterilized linen cloths, boiled in water and ashes, for Isabeau to use as bandages, an act of collaboration that lifted her craft from mere subsistence to a form of medical charity. The smell of ashes, mingling with fresh linen, became the perfume of this new partnership, a fragrance of care. Gauthier, the peasant, also approached Isabeau, not because he was sick, but out of practical curiosity. He asked about the health of the animals, and Isabeau shared a historical insight. the use of certain plants, like wild garlic, to ward off parasites in livestock, a small but vital effort to protect the last reserves of wealth and protein families still had. Gautier felt the coarse, damp soil beneath his fingers as he showed Isabeau where such plants could be found. Their conversation introduced a new perspective, the interdependence between human health and animal health. The sound of pigs grunting in the pen, once just background noise, now carried a new meaning of vitality and vulnerability. Gautier promised Isabeau a small portion of rendered fat in exchange for a tonic for his wife, a quiet example of the crisis economy taking shape. Alban documented Isabeau's description of urban housing, tall, crowded buildings with sewage running openly through the streets, an overwhelming contrast to the cleaner, smaller village of Saint-Gilles. The stench of rot and filth she spoke of was the smell of the disease she'd left behind, a reminder of how essential sanitation was. He also observed the village children who, despite their malnutrition, looked at Isabeau with a soft sense of wonder. With gentle hands, she taught them how to distinguish poisonous herbs from healing ones, a small, practical lesson for difficult times. Her calm, instructive voice drifted through the air like a slow melody of knowledge, spreading quietly outward. When Abbot Frederick said a temporary farewell to Isabeau, he made a gesture of serene contemplation. He gave her a small oak wood crucifix, feeling the smooth, cool texture of the aged wood, a simple symbol of protection. Isabeau, in return, gave Alban a small vial of ink made from soot and gum arabic so he could continue his work, a gift of practical and intellectual value. Brother Alban felt the chill of the little ink vial in his hand, a tactile reminder of gratitude. He watched Isabeau's group depart, the sound of hooves slowly fading, taking with them the scent of herbs and tar toward other villages. And though Saint-Gilles remained grey and cold, the landscape felt slightly less desolate, infused with a new energy of struggle and care. Movement had brought risk, but it had also brought the tools to face it. The day was wrapped in dense fog, with a bone-deep cold, and Brother Alban's focus narrowed to a single object, Abbot Frederick's handheld scale. This measuring tool, made of polished bronze with copper pans, wasn't used to weigh gold coins, but to distribute grain with almost ritual precision, a gesture, a habit that had become the moral center of abbey life. Alban felt the smooth, metallic chill of the bronze as he examined it, a texture that spoke of justice and scarcity. The faint click of the pans settling into balance was the gentle melody of fairness in a time of stark inequality. The scale, an authentic historical object of the era commonly used in markets, had now become the last line of defense against social chaos. The exact weight of each portion served as a visual reminder that monks and villagers alike shared the same austerity. Alban described in his chronicle the matte glow of the aged bronze, its dark, oxidized tones contrasting with the pale barley placed into one of the pans. The cold scent of metal mixing with the dry smell of grain became the aroma of rationed survival. Abbot Frederick handled the scale with deliberate, almost poetic slowness. His long, delicate fingers, accustomed to turning pages of parchment, now devoted themselves to the discipline of distribution. He moved with calm repetition, waiting for the precise alignment of the beam, teaching without a single word the virtue of patience in a time ruled by urgency and despair. The feel of the thin metal chain brushing against his fingers was a tactile reminder of the fragile balance he fought to preserve within the community. Alban thought of Gautier, the peasant who brought his modest exchanges, a lump of tallow or a handful of roots, to be weighed on the scale. For Gautier, the gesture wasn't humiliating but comforting, because the exact measure was his guarantee he wouldn't be cheated. a rare sense of belonging and order in a disordered world. The soft plock of the damp tallow landing in the copper pan was a sound of value, and the peasant watched the scale with the same attention he gave the sky, searching for a sign of justice. This small human story surrounding the scale became Alban's metaphor for the crisis. The cold had thrown nature out of balance, yet human effort, symbolized by that bronze instrument, struggled to restore social equilibrium. In one of his reflections, Abbot Frederick compared the coldness of the scale to the coldness of divine justice itself, something that could not be rushed or corrupted, a serene contemplation on morality during extreme deprivation. The monk sensed a shift in the air each time the weighing ritual took place, as if the focused attention around the chilled instrument created its own pocket of stillness. The faint smell of Margot, the weaver, drifting in as she came for her weekly portion, clean linen with a hint of soot, was the fragrance of hard work and preserved dignity, gently hanging over the scale as she received her grain. Alban noted that the scale was a shared symbol of trust, a historical link between the weight of grain and the weight of the abbot's word. He described the craftsmanship of the counterweights, small pieces of lead and polished stone, smooth and cold to the touch, that were kept in a dark, fragrant wooden box, a subtle mystery of mathematical precision in a world ruled by uncertainty. The bronze object, cold and exact, had become the center of a new kind of faith in human order, a visual and tactile anchor amid a climate-driven storm. When Alban finished writing about the scale, he closed his eyes, feeling the rough texture of the parchment beneath his quill, and let the image of perfect balance lull him into a quiet sense of belonging and calm. Still focused on the bronze scale, Brother Alban expanded his reflection toward the idea of social trust the instrument had come to symbolize. He noted that weighing the last bundle of hay or the final handful of lentils with absolute precision was more than economics. It was a ritual of community. Abbot Frederick's calm voice announcing each weight, steady, deliberate, almost solemn, reinforced the sense of order, a reminder that the law, even in the midst of hunger, still held its place. The cold touch of the scale's bronze felt like the touch of an undeniable truth. He thought about Margot, the weaver, who never trusted the metal scales of wandering merchants, but came to the abbey because she trusted the abbot's integrity. Her small human story was one of unequal exchange. A meter of her hard-woven linen, the product of long hours at her loom, was worth only enough to feed her child for 2 days. The clean scent of linen and the soft thud of her labor being measured created an atmosphere of quiet sacrifice, something Alban tried to preserve faithfully in his writing. The monk devoted a section of his chronicle to the texture and taste of food during that period, a detail he considered essential. He described the bread made from barley mixed with broad beans or acorns, heavy, coarse, and cold, something that required long chewing and felt hard to swallow. Its earthy, bitter flavor, when compared to the sweet, nourishing wheat of earlier years, was the taste of deprivation itself, a sensory marker of the Great Famine. He recorded a curious historical consequence of the crisis, the forced medieval exchange rate of livestock. With pasture scarce and hay dwindling under the relentless cold, keeping large animals became unsustainable. Many peasants, including Gauthier, were forced to sell or slaughter their cows and oxen, trading them for grain, less nutritious perhaps, but denser in calories and easier to store. The smell of livestock in Gauthier's barn, once the aroma of prosperity, had turned into the scent of anxiety. Alban watched the faint light filtering into the library, catching the bronze scale just enough to cast pale golden reflections. He used the metaphor of the scale as a sun of fairness, a small moral light in a world drowned in an unending winter. The temperature around the scale felt, ironically, like the most stable in the abbey because it sat at the center of order and control. Gautier had told Alban the small story of his neighbor who, after slaughtering his last ox, shared the meat with the entire village in exchange for promises of seeds and beans for the next spring, a social contract born of famine. The sound of the slaughter, a mixture of desperation and generosity, became the melody of final hope. Gautier recalled the cold, oily texture of the fresh meat in his hands, a fleeting wealth that would turn within hours into shared subsistence. The monk also detailed how the scale was used to measure firewood, now as precious as food itself. Wood meant heat, the only true protection against the cold that caused disease and death. Abbot Frederick weighed bundles of firewood with the same precision he used for grain. The smell of oak smoke and the sharp crack of an axe splitting logs were, therefore, scents and sounds of both monetary value and survival. He deepened his observation of Margot's habit of mending. She used small patches of dark fabrics with varied textures to repair her family's clothing. The touch of those patched garments was rough, full of seams, a tactile map of scarcity, but their appearance carried dignity and care, a small act of resistance against disorder. Alban recorded that Abbot Frederick had made an ingenious adaptation. He used different counterweights on each pan to represent the nutritional value of various goods. For example, Gauthier's tallow was weighed more favorably than simple barley, a primitive form of medieval caloric accounting. It was a quiet demonstration of monastic intelligence and charity at work. The monk ended this section, feeling the light weight of the scale as he placed it back into its box, a weight that carried the moral burden of the entire village. The intimate image of that cold, exact instrument became the central metaphor of his chronicle, the struggle for balance in a world that had fallen out of balance. The slow, steady rhythm of his own pulse was the only sound left to confirm life as the village of Saint-Gilles slept under its blanket of ice, waiting for its next fragile step forward. The cold lingered over the village of Saint-Gilles, and Brother Alban spent the morning expanding his chronicle, connecting Gautier's and Margot's individual struggles to the community's collective effort and its ties to the Abbey of Cluny. He noted an unusual movement, the arrival of a group of mendicant hermits from the mountains, driven down by the brutal cold and the exhaustion of their provisions. These hermits, led by an elderly man named Brother Silas, were a small human story of faith and asceticism stretched to its limits by the Little Ice Age. Brother Silas carried with him the strong, sweet scent of pine resin and frozen mountain soil, an aroma of isolation now blending with the smoke and barley smells of the village. The texture of his clothes, made of coarse, heavily patched wool, formed a tactile map of years of self-imposed privation, which had now become a forced deprivation by the climate. The rhythmic, slow crunch of their footsteps on compacted snow was the sound of quiet resignation, and their presence expanded the crisis far beyond the borders of the village. In an act of widened charity, Abbot Frederick offered the hermits a section of the barn for the night and a portion of the abbey's porridge. He knew that welcoming these men, held in high spiritual regard in medieval society, was a gesture of religious solidarity that strengthened the unity of the community. It was a historical truth. Cold forced the movement of entire social groups, bringing the secluded monastic world into contact with the outside during moments of crisis. Alban took care to record a social curiosity Brother Silas revealed. The hermits maintained a silent communication network through carved marks on trees and small stone niches, exchanging information about wildlife and weather conditions. It was a primitive form of social intelligence, An invisible survival web stretched across forest and mountain, broadening Alban's awareness of the collective struggle against the cold. Gautier, seeing Brother Silas, felt a subtle contrast. He admired the hermit's faith, but his own was rooted in the soil and in manual labor. He traded some extra firewood for a strip of dried deer hide the hermit carried, feeling the rough, cold texture of the leather, a vital material for repairing his boots. The mixed scents of wood smoke and leather became the aroma of an essential exchange, one that kept both men inching forward through hardship. Margot, the weaver, saw in the hermits an opportunity to use her small strands of nettle and ramie. She offered Brother Silas small cloth patches in exchange for birch bark used by the hermits for writing and by her as kindling. The soft, rhythmic beat of Margot's loom as she worked became the pulse of her contribution to collective survival, showing how individual labor quietly strengthened the whole. Alban reflected on the economy of scarcity unfolding in the village. Everyone was bound together in a network of exchange and mutual dependence. Margot's weaving, Gauthier's firewood, and Abbot Frédéric's fair distribution were threads of a collective force refusing to collapse under crisis. The cold was the catalyst of this forced unity, revealing the true strength of the community's social fabric. The monk felt the temperature inside the library growing sharper, chilled further by the steady snowfall outside, a soft, muffled sound that seemed to isolate the abbey from the rest of the world. He touched his quill, feeling its cold, familiar texture, and focused on recording the hermit's story as a poetic reminder that even those who chose solitude were now forced to return to the community to survive the relentless winter. The presence of the mendicant hermits, led by Brother Silas, broadened the landscape of St. Gilles in a way Brother Alban felt compelled to capture. He observed the complex social curiosity their arrival introduced. Men of profound sanctity, who had renounced all earthly goods, now depended on the charity of peasants and monks, showing how the cold had reversed the very hierarchy of dependence. The scent of unwashed cloth, mixed with the sweet, earthy aroma of wild herbs that clung to Silas, was the perfume of devotion forced back into community. Alban recorded the small human story unfolding between Gautier and Brother Silas. The peasant offered the hermit a place to sleep in his barn, so he could share the animal's body heat, a form of cooperation built on temperature and mutual survival. Gautier felt the rough, cold texture of the straw covering the barn floor, but he knew that, warmed by the animals, it became a life-saving mattress for the hermit, a tactile gesture of pragmatic charity. Abbot Frédéric used the presence of Isabeau and the hermits to organize a community gathering, a historical reflection of how crisis often reinforced social cohesion around the church. The low, tense murmur of voices assembled in the abbey courtyard sounded like a rhythm of hope and fear. The abbot held up the bronze scale as a visual symbol of his promise of fair distribution, and Alban felt the metal's cold weight as a sign of the gravity of the moment. Margot, the weaver, saw her contribution expand. She was no longer weaving only for her family, but now for the hermits as well. She traded a length of her nettle linen, coarse and scratchy, for dried oak bark Silas had collected, which she planned to use for medicinal tea and for subtly dyeing her fabrics. This exchange of material and knowledge was the essence of the new crisis economy, subsistence traded for subsistence. Alban described an economic curiosity of the period. The rise in value of forest products, wild honey, dried berries, and hunting leather, while agricultural goods failed. Gautier now devoted himself more to gathering and discreet hunting than to farming, a sign of forced adaptation to the climate. The lingering scent of gunpowder and hunting smoke, an aroma of risk, had become Gautier's new perfume. The monk sensed the contrast between the hermit's calm and the peasant's restlessness. Brother Silas, long accustomed to privation, carried a quiet serenity that felt like a form of passive resistance. He touched the cold ground with his palm in a contemplative gesture, a way of connecting with the stubborn resilience of the earth itself. Alban saw this difference as a poetic counterpoint in the story of the crisis. Isabeau taught Margot and the other women how to boil herbs and roots to make teas and decoctions, a small defense against weakness and intestinal illness. The warm, earthy smell of simmering plants, primitive medicine, filled the abbey kitchen, becoming a new olfactory rhythm of collective care. The heat of the ceramic bowls in their hands was a small, tactile luxury of comfort. Alban used the metaphor of Margot's web to describe the community's interconnection. Every strand of linen, every handful of grain, every prayer from Silas, and every act of charity from Frederick were threads holding the village together, a woven net of resistance against the cold that threatened to unravel them. The soft, steady beat of Margot's loom echoed this constant rhythm of unity. He recorded a small historical curiosity related to animal life, the use of cereal straw as supplemental feed for livestock, a clear sign of the shortage of hay. Straw held little nutritional value, but it offered some fiber, and the warmth generated during digestion, its dry, familiar smell, once ordinary, had become precious, and Alban felt its rough texture between his fingers as he wrote. Abbot Frederick organized a special nighttime service in the chapel, a gesture meant to strengthen hope and provide a warm place for the poorest villagers. The deep, slow cadence of Gregorian chants echoed through the abbey's cold stone, a rhythm of spiritual comfort. As Alban finished his morning writing, he watched the faint candlelight glowing inside the chapel, a quiet image of persistent hope in the midst of a relentless winter. The cold had intensified during the night, reaching the point where even the deepest mud had frozen solid, leaving the village of Saint-Gilles wrapped in near absolute silence. Brother Alban used this forced pause for quiet contemplation, dedicating himself to recording the invisible life that still persisted beneath the crust of ice and stillness. He felt the dry, biting chill, the kind that makes your teeth clench, and the air in the abbey library, though cold, carried the scent of aged wood and parchment, a smell of intellectual stability in contrast to nature's turmoil. He focused on a simple object on his desk, a small clay jar filled with water, which he kept close by for mixing ink. The jar's rough, cold texture mirrored the morning's austerity, and its contents were partially frozen. He watched the milky sheen of ice forming on the surface, a quiet scene of slow, peaceful crystallization. The soft, delicate sound of the ice cracking as the temperature shifted was the only melody breaking the abbey's heavy silence, a rhythm of nature in its most subdued and imposing form. Alban reflected on the peasant wisdom of Gautier and Margot, who understood that ice forming on the surface of a lake or well acted as insulation, protecting the aquatic life and the liquid water below. He recorded this as a subtle cultural observation, the acceptance and understanding of the cold's paradoxes. Gautier had told him a small story about how he listened to the sound of ice to determine its thickness, a vital blend of tactile and auditory knowledge for crossing frozen rivers safely. The contemplative stillness allowed Alban to describe the medieval custom of covering doors and windows with wool blankets and bundles of straw for insulation. Margot had used her thickest scraps and handfuls of straw from her mattress to seal her cabin, a quiet labor of conserving heat. The smell of dry straw and damp wool carried the scent of safety, and the thick, warm feel of those coverings offered a sense of refuge from the penetrating cold. He felt the smooth, cool texture of the goose quill between his fingers, an instrument that helped him draw poetic metaphors. He described the day's silence as a great white blanket draped over the village, and the cold as an honored guest, accepted with resignation. Abbot Frederick, keeping to his unbroken routine, used the quiet to meditate, reinforcing the idea that physical stillness could generate tremendous spiritual strength. Alban dedicated his writing to a cultural observation on solidarity. The lack of movement in the village didn't signal isolation, but rather a strategic retreat, an unspoken agreement to conserve energy and resources. The faint smell of burning peat drifting from the few chimneys was the most important sign of life, the scent of silent and stubborn resistance. The pale daylight filtering through the window carried a bluish tint, a fragile hue that made the silence feel even deeper. He recorded a historical curiosity related to the economy, the practice of harvesting ice during the winter to preserve food in the summer, storing it in underground cellars. The cold that now felt like a curse would one day become a valuable resource. This paradox offered a subtle counterpoint of hope woven into the narrative. The stillness forced by the cold sharpened Brother Alban's senses, allowing him to capture the subtle nuances of the village's expanded silence. He studied the surface of the snow, noting the thermal sensation it created. Fresh snow, soft and feather-light, acted as both a sound and heat insulator, muffling the noises of the village while retaining the ground's faint warmth. This sonic quietness felt to Alban like a form of contemplative serenity, drawing him inward. He thought of Margot, the weaver, who used the pause in Gautier's farm work to focus entirely on her loom. The loom's steady, rhythmic clatter, once merely the sound of survival, had become a melody of resilience and inner labor, a beat of hope refusing to be silenced by winter. The smell of linen and straw inside her cabin, though humble, was the scent of a life that persisted. Abbot Frederick used the tranquility to inspect the abbey's manuscripts, a form of intellectual retreat. He checked whether the cold's moisture had damaged the parchment, and the dry, brittle texture beneath his fingers reminded him that knowledge, like life, was fragile and required constant care. He read softly from texts describing harsh winters centuries ago, a cultural contemplation linking present hardship to historical memory. Alban noted a quiet cultural shift. The peasants were using the silence to revive oral storytelling, recounting old legends of past winters and divine interventions during times of famine. The low, flowing voices in the warm cabins became a rhythm of shared memory and social comfort, a small human history of community cohesion sparked unintentionally by the cold. Gauthier had told him a legend of a winter that lasted 7 years, when people survived on roots alone and melted snow. An exaggerated tale, perhaps, but one that served as a kind of mental survival manual. The smell of ashes and smoke lingering on Gautier's clothes was the scent of the hearth, the center of that universe of stories. Brother Alban used the metaphor of air bubbles trapped in ice, the ones he saw inside his jar of water, to describe the human soul, held captive by the cold, yet still containing breath, promise, and the will to move again once the thaw arrived. The sight of those tiny spheres, pockets of life embedded in hard ice, became a poetic image of quiet endurance. Before leaving, Isabeau had given the abbot notes describing the practice of isolating the sick in towns, a primitive form of quarantine born from fear of contagion. The contrast between such forced isolation and the peaceful retreat of Saint-Gilles offered Alban a profound reflection. He felt the smooth, cool texture of the goosequill pen in his fingers, an instrument that allowed him to record these details with almost microscopic precision. The absence of commercial and labor sounds was, in truth, a sound of conservation, a rhythm of strategic waiting that he described with calm and fluidity. Alban wrote that the pale blue tint spreading across the sky that day was the color of quiet hope, a promise that the sun, though weak, had not abandoned the earth. a serene visual he tried to translate onto the page. He ended the section with a meditative reflection on life in its most dormant form, patiently waiting for the return of warmth. Brother Alban began the new day with a deliberate shift in perspective, choosing to observe the world through the eyes of Abbot Frederick, the pragmatic and spiritual leader of the Abbey of Cluny. His viewpoint moved away from the peasants' struggles and toward the management of the crisis from within the cloister, revealing a different set of worries and a new way of seeing the cold. The abbot, whose very name evoked the warmth of faith, felt the chill within his responsibilities, a weight far more penetrating than the cold in the air. The thermal sensation inside his small office was one of cold stone and reverent silence. Abbot Frederick, a man accustomed to the slow and orderly rhythm of monastic life, now found himself dealing with logistical chaos. His greatest concern, which Alban faithfully recorded, was maintaining the community's mental and moral health, a parallel story of leadership under strain. He knew that, beyond food, people needed rituals and certainties to fend off despair. The sound of his slow, measured footsteps along the stone corridors became a melody of order, a rhythm he imposed on the disorder outside. Alban watched the abbot's calm, repetitive gesture as he inspected the beeswax candles, a luxury now being rationed. Frederick touched the wax with the tips of his fingers, feeling its smooth, cool texture, a tactile reminder of nature's gift now growing scarce. The sweet, comforting scent of pure wax, a fragrance of devotion, was his single remaining luxury in that winter of privation. A new sensation had begun to seep into the abbey, the scent of fear and panic from distant villages, carried by messengers pleading for help and reporting deaths from starvation. This aroma of despair was what troubled Frederick most, and he fought it by increasing the hours of communal prayer, an historical reminder that religious and climatic crises often walked hand in hand. The deep, slow tones of the Gregorian chants he led became his response to the world's chaos. In a quiet moment of contemplation, Abbot Frederick shared with Alban a detail of his own diet. He had replaced bread with a porridge made of acorns and dried roots, coarse in texture and bitter in taste, ensuring that his suffering matched that of the peasants. It was a small, human story of leadership by example, a silent act of charity Alban deeply admired. He had discreetly decided to sell one of the abbey's silver chalices to a wealthy merchant from afar in exchange for good quality olive oil for the infirmary, a resource vital for wound care and for lighting during the long nights. The cool, smooth feel of the silver, a sacred object, and the strong aroma of olive oil, a fragrance of healing, represented the difficult exchange between the spiritual and the pragmatic that the crisis demanded. Alban also recorded an interesting detail about monastic bookkeeping of the time. Abbot Frederick had begun using a new system of wooden boards with charcoal marks, easier to erase and reuse than expensive parchment, a sign of material austerity and adaptation. The sound of charcoal scraping across wood formed a rhythm of calculation and frugality. Brother Alban's new focus on Abbot Frederick revealed the subtle battle of nerves unfolding inside the abbey. The abbot was implementing a historically significant practice, the introduction of emergency bread made from crushed acorns mixed with barley, a true last resort food. The strong, bitter smell of tannins and boiled oak, an aroma of extreme necessity, hung over the abbey's kitchen as Frederick supervised the mixture. He felt the coarse, dark dough beneath his fingers, its rough texture a reminder of sustenance that was unpleasant, yet vital. Alban noted that Abbot Frederick had begun using more poetic metaphors in his sermons, describing the winter as God's sieve, separating grain from chaff, a way of giving spiritual meaning to calamity. The sound of his calm, steady voice offered a rhythm of comfort, an anchor for the peasants' minds, transforming physical cold into a trial of the soul. The friar recorded the quiet human story behind the sale of the silver chalice. The merchant who bought it, a wealthy man from Dijon named Lord Audran, insisted on taking the object in secret, hidden beneath pelts and thick wool. The cool feel of the silver being handed over and the muffled sound of the chalice wrapped in cloth formed the soft melody of a silent sacrifice where the monk's need outweighed devotion and beauty. Before departing, Dr. Isabeau had taught the abbot how to prepare an infusion made from willow bark, rich in salicin, a precursor to aspirin, to ease the aches and fevers caused by cold and malnutrition. The slightly sweet, slightly bitter scent of the infusion was the fragrance of primitive healing, and Abbot Frederick felt the warm liquid in his hands, a tactile comfort in his new role as pragmatic healer. Alban reflected on the abbey's economy. The crisis was forcing it to diversify its sources of income and subsistence. Abbot Frederick had ordered the monks to make more baskets and mats from reeds and willow, materials that thrived in the cold, to trade for butter and eggs. The soft, rhythmic sound of basket weaving became a new work rhythm inside the abbey, a quiet sign of adaptation. While inspecting the barn where the peasant Gauthier slept alongside Brother Silas, the abbot noticed a small story of cooperation. Gauthier had used his own linen cloth, given to him by Margot, to patch a hole in the roof, trapping the animal's warmth inside. The rough feel of Margot's linen against the barn's rafters became a tactile symbol of expanding family and community unity. Alban then recorded the abbot's serene contemplation of the stars, which appeared sharper and colder that winter. Frederick compared their distant frostiness to the chill of hardship, yet the light they cast became his metaphor for hope. He felt the dry night air in the abbey's observatory, a physical reminder of the universe's vastness and indifference, standing in subtle contrast to the small, warm flame of faith in his heart. The friar used the poetic image of snow on parchment to describe how hardship settled onto his chronicle, making it heavier and truer. The smooth, cool feel of the parchment beneath his quill reminded him that he was the caretaker of memory, the chronicler of the Great Famine. He noticed the dark, almost black color of the acorn bread, a stark visual of deprivation, yet it was the bread of life that winter. Abbot Frederick insisted that it be eaten with gratitude, turning the act of sharing into a ritual of resistance. The soft, muted sound of bread being torn became the rhythm of sacrifice and survival. Frederick's new perspective was an invitation to calm resignation, to accept the cold as a teacher and scarcity as a lesson. Brother Alban, ending his section, felt the thermal sensation of understanding, the warmth of comprehension in a world slowly freezing around him. The day began with a subtle but striking visual phenomenon over the village of Saint-Gilles, a solar halo shimmering in the frigid air, an iridescent ring of pale light encircling the distant sun. It heightened every visual sense, hinting at an even harsher cold on the way. Brother Alban felt the dry, piercing chill in his nose and recorded the austere beauty of this optical display as a poetic spectacle of nature in crisis. He reflected on how light and color became more precious in times of deprivation, turning simple sight into a form of spiritual nourishment, a gentle counterpoint to the darkness of hunger. This heightened sensitivity became Alban's new focus. He devoted himself to capturing the subtle sounds and movements that persisted through the stillness of winter. The most constant and curious sound was the creaking of wooden posts in fences and houses, expanding and contracting with the shifting temperatures between day and night. It was a melody of living wood, groaning under the cold, a slow, repetitive rhythm that felt like the winter's own voice. Gauthier, the peasant, had developed his sense of smell into a survival tool, becoming almost expert at distinguishing old ice from new ice. Old ice, denser and more dangerous, carried a more mineral, neutral smell, while new ice, brittle and thin, breathed a damp, earthy scent. Gauthier used this sharpened sense to judge the risks of his walks to gather firewood, a small human story of adaptation and tactile intelligence. The feel of ice beneath his boots became the map of his survival. Abbot Frederick introduced a curious medieval custom to fight the cold, the warming hour. During this single hour each day, monks and villagers were allowed to gather around a massive charcoal brazier in the abbey's crypt, a subterranean space that held heat well. The soft crackle of burning charcoal and the strong penetrating scent of its smoke, the aroma of artificial warmth, were among the few sensory luxuries they had left. The sudden warmth spreading through their hands was an intense, necessary comfort for the body. Margot, the weaver, had honed her sense of touch to judge linen quality in the dark, since light was scarce. She could distinguish nettle fibers from pure flax solely by touch, feeling the roughness and firmness of the ramy thread. This heightened sensitivity was her way of ensuring her cloth held as much value as possible in the barter economy. The sight of her fingers, quick and precise at the loom, even in the dim light, was the portrait of her dedication. Alban also recorded another medieval custom of the time, the use of heated stones wrapped in cloth to warm one's feet in bed or in work niches. Margot and Gauthier relied on this method, heating the stones in the hearth and feeling the dense, lingering warmth beneath the wool, a tactile comfort that carried them through the freezing night. The friar felt the smooth, cool touch of his goose-feather quill between his fingers and used it to shape a poetic metaphor. The whisper of hunger, the quiet rumble of empty stomachs he felt in his own body, a sound that was simply the amplification of need in its most intimate form. Brother Alban continued focusing on the heightened senses of that winter, recording the small signs of life the cold tried so hard to smother. He noticed the sharp, acrid scent of fermented apple musk drifting from the village huts, a rustic distillation aroma. It was a historical curiosity tied to survival, the making of cider and other distilled drinks, far more resistant to the cold than wine or grain ales, had become a vital source of calories and inner warmth for the peasants. The soft sound of water dripping from the abbey's thatched roof, a rare rhythmic drop, felt like a melody of hope to Alban, a sign that the stone's leftover warmth was beginning the slow work of thawing. He observed the dark, damp patch of straw from which the drip fell, a small, decaying bit of life that still released moisture essential for the plant's survival. Gauthier, the peasant, had sharpened his visual sense toward the snow itself, learning to distinguish the cool blue shadows of new snow from the yellowed tint of older, potentially contaminated patches. It was a small human story shaped by necessity, where the feeling under his feet and the subtle difference in color worked together to determine the safety of his roots. He felt the cold, fluffy texture of new snow in his hands, a fleeting, fragile purity. Abbot Frederick had instructed the monks to sing louder during the liturgical hours, not only as an act of devotion, but as a way to generate body heat and maintain their energy, a subtle group survival practice. The amplified sound of Gregorian chant vibrating through the abbey's cold stone was a rhythm of both physical and spiritual endurance. The temperature inside the chapel rose ever so slightly with the strength of their voices. Margot, the weaver, had discovered that the strong smell of linseed oil, used to treat her linen, helped repel insects and rats drawn to the dwindling grain stores. She spread the oil along the edges of her cabin, a small olfactory shield that supported her long hours at the loom. Its texture was sticky and cold, but to Margot, its scent was the smell of safety. Alban noted another practical adaptation, the widespread use of black clothing among the poorest. The pigment, made from soot and charcoal, was cheap and easy to produce, and the dark color, though somber, absorbed more of the sun's weak warmth. The village's sea of dark garments became a visual symbol of mourning, but also of resilience. He felt the rough texture of the straw he had stuffed along the library window to block the cold. He used a poetic metaphor, the swallowed sounds of winter, to describe the laughter of children, the clinking of cups, the noise of animals in the pasture, all of which now existed only in memory. With senses heightened, the absence of sound felt even more eloquent and melancholic. Alban observed the slow shift of light in the sky, wavering between a deep leaden grey and a pale milk-white glow. That visual uncertainty mirrored the climate crisis itself, which refused to offer any predictable rhythm. The scratch of his quill against the parchment was the only steady pattern he could control, a slow, steady sound of order amid sensory disorder. He thought of Brother Silas's small human story. The hermit had left the abbey to bring a portion of Frederick's porridge to those living even farther in isolation. The soft, dragging sound of his steps and the coarse texture of his robes brushing through the snow formed a moving picture of charity, a rhythm of altruism, amplified by the cold. At the end of his section, the friar closed his eyes, feeling the temperature of his own skin and the familiar scent of parchment, a fragrance of permanence. He let the slow rhythm of his breathing guide him, knowing the struggle continued, but also knowing his chronicle, with its heightened senses, would preserve every sound, scent and touch from this age of ice. The cold in the village of Saint-Gilles was shifting in a slow, almost imperceptible way, a change Brother Alban recorded with quiet poetic precision. It wasn't a thaw, but a gentle alternation in the emotional and visual temperature. The sun, still pale and weak, lingered a little longer before sinking, and the daylight, once a heavy lead grey, now carried a faint, milky yellow tint at noon. It was a subtle visual whisper of hope, one that contrasted sharply with the reality underfoot. The sound of running water, which had once been only the groaning of ice, now included the quick, intermittent dripping of tiny meltings along the eaves, a hesitant rhythm of slow promise. Abbot Frederick had noticed this shift in the light and wove it into his sermons, reminding the villagers that the cold was not eternal but cyclical, and patience was the key to enduring the trial. He felt the air on his skin grow slightly lighter at midday, a brief reprieve from the dense night chill. The familiar scent of ash and peat smoke, once heavy and somber, now mingled with a faint resinous hint of pine, warmed by the weak sunlight, a fleeting perfume of relief. Brother Alban often returned to the metaphor of eyes that adjust to the darkness, describing how the community slowly adapted to scarcity. Deprivation, repeated day after day, had become the new normal, and their struggle now was to not forget what abundance once felt like. He felt the smooth, familiar texture of the goose feather between his fingers, an instrument of order amid confusion. Gauthier, the peasant, noticed this slow shift in his work. He had begun digging, inch by inch, through the sheltered ground near his cabin, where the manure and ashes he'd scattered had formed an insulating layer. The damp, slightly warm feel of the soil under his spade, a sharp contrast to the frozen earth around it, was the touch of a promise of life. He breathed in the strong, earthy scent rising from the ground, a smell of labor and of future. Margot, the weaver, used the shifting light to inspect her fabrics more precisely, hunting for flaws that might lower the linen's value in trade. She had changed the rhythm of her loom, working faster while the light held and slowing as dusk approached, a small human story of adaptation to the cycle of the sun. The soft, steady hum of her quicker weaving became the melody of her efficiency. The friar recorded a historical curiosity about the growing trade in furs and wool brought on by the cold. Villagers were exchanging their last scraps of meat for rabbit and fox pelts from itinerant hunters. The touch of those pelts, soft and warm, stood in poetic contrast to the coarse, cold texture of their woolen clothes. The animal, wild scent of the hides was the aroma of a subsistence economy rising out of necessity. He observed again the dark color of the acorn bread, an image of hardship, yet also a small story of ingenuity and sacrifice. Its repeated presence in his chronicle served as a gentle reminder of their struggle. The slow, steady scratch of his quill against the parchment became his anchor against the disarray outside. The slow shift in the daylight, now lingering a little longer, brought Brother Alban a faint sense of renewal, even though the cold was still the ruling force of the season. He recorded that Abbot Frederick had ordered the replanting of small herb gardens inside the abbey, placing clay pots warmed by embers to take advantage of the extended light. The fresh, slightly minty scent of the first sprouting sage and rosemary, a fragrance of new life, offered a gentle, welcome contrast to the persistent smell of peat and ash. Abbot Frederick was using the slow change to reinforce the practice of fasting in a strategic way, a historical habit rooted in religious discipline. He didn't impose fasting as punishment, but as an act of preservation, a practical way to stretch what little remained for the harsher days he knew would still come. The sound of silence in the refectory, where meals had become sparse, felt like the rhythm of an economy shaped by faith. Alban noticed that the intense cold of the previous months had created a thick sheet of ice over the rivers, which now began to weaken under the longer light, cracking in small, audible snaps, a sound that revealed the winter's fragility. He described the broken ice, with its pale white tones and dark fractures, as a kind of map showing nature's struggle to break free. Gauthier, the peasant, used the extra daylight to intensify his search for wild roots and tubers in the forest, work that became more effective with better visibility. He had taken up the habit of touching the ground with the tip of his bare foot, a brave gesture sharpened by tactile instinct to distinguish frozen soil from softer earth where roots might hide. The brief, stinging sensation of that contact was painful, yet essential to his search. Margot, the weaver, used the brighter light to teach her son how to weave small pieces of rope from linen and ramy fiber, a small human story of passing down skills and encouraging early work. The soft, rhythmic sound of the boy's fingers twisting the rope was the quiet melody of learning and hope for the future. Brother Alban also noted a historical curiosity about the use of turnip oil and animal tallow, resources not only used for cooking, but also for greasing wagon wheels and metal hinges to keep them from freezing or grinding. This dual purpose of a precious material was a testament to how versatile every resource had to be in times of scarcity. The strong, rancid smell of the tallow was the unmistakable scent of a pragmatic solution crafted for the cold. He turned again to his poetic metaphor of a shrinking shadow to describe the sun's slow return, a sign that winter was slowly losing its grip. The gentle repetition of this image in his writing was a quiet comfort both to himself and to his reader. The familiar feel of the quill resting in his hand served as an anchor of stability amid the slow shifts of daily life. In a serene moment of reflection, Abbot Frederick had asked the monks to clear the snow from the rooftops, not just for safety, but to let the sunlight reach the stone and absorb even the smallest hint of warmth. The muffled scrape of shovels on snow and the sight of the dark stones gathering light became the rhythm and color of a collective effort against the cold. Alban noted that the dark earth emerging in Gautier's fields was a visual sign that the darkness of hardship was slowly giving way to the brown of fertility. Gautier felt the cold, damp texture of the soil, a touch of hard labor, yet full of the promise of life. The slow shift in the season was the very definition of medieval resilience, a continuous, understated battle against the climate. The sound of his quill moving across the parchment became the final rhythm of the day, a calm closing note in a world patiently waiting for the gradual return of warmth. Brother Alban sensed a different smell in the air at the Abbey of Cluny, a faint, earthy scent of thawing soil and deep moisture, a sign that the little ice age, though still present, was beginning to loosen its grip ever so slowly. The change was almost imperceptible, yet he recorded it as the first step toward the end of the crisis. It was a time more suited to quiet retreat than movement, a gentle preparation for the closing of a long ordeal. He used this atmosphere of withdrawal to revisit earlier moments of his chronicle. He thought about Margot, the weaver, and her tireless work. He noted that the linen she had woven throughout the winter, rough in texture and dark in color, was now being traded for barley and bean seeds for the upcoming planting season, a barter of survival for hope. The soft feel of the seeds resting in her palm was a small touch of the future, a poetic contrast to the cold that still lingered. Abbot Frederick had ordered the final cleaning and organizing of the abbey's granaries, a ritual marking the end of scarcity. The scraping sound of shovels and brooms over the stone floor, clearing away the last of the old grain and dust, formed a rhythm of purification and accountability. The musty smell of spoiled grain, an aroma of deprivation, was slowly being replaced by the scent of washed stone and fresh air, drifting in through the open doors. Alban also recorded one last historical curiosity the abbot had mentioned, the increasing cultivation of oats and rye instead of wheat. These winter cereals were far more resistant to cold and damp weather, and their widespread adoption after the Great Famine would reshape Europe's agricultural landscape, a sign of forced adaptation and a different future taking shape. He felt the shifting temperature on his skin, the dry morning cold giving way to a brief, humid warmth at midday, a physical reminder of transition. He returned to his poetic metaphor of the lengthening shadow to describe how time itself seemed to stretch, offering more hours of light and labor, a sign that darkness was gradually losing its rule. Gautier, the peasant, had turned his attention to repairing his plough, an instrument untouched for many long months. The soft, steady rhythm of his hammer striking the cold iron, an unmistakable rhythm of preparation, became the melody of work returning to the fields. He felt the coarse, familiar texture of the plough's wooden beam, a reassuring touch that grounded him in his craft. Brother Alban reflected on a small human story of unity. Brother Silas, the hermit, had returned to the abbey and was helping Gautier fix the plough, trading his rustic carpentry skills for food. The sight of the monk and the peasant working side by side, their hands moving over wood and metal together, was the image of solidarity forged by hardship. He organized his parchments, feeling the thin, smooth texture beneath his fingertips, and allowed his thoughts to settle on the quiet anticipation of an ending. He knew the conclusion of the famine wouldn't bring celebration, but rather a slow and silent return to hard work, and his chronicle needed to reflect that serenity. In the quiet of that day, Brother Alban breathed in the scent of damp wood and ashes, an aroma no longer tied to crisis, but to continued effort. He turned his attention back to Margot, the weaver, and to her wisdom in conserving resources. She was now teaching the village women how to weave with nettle fiber, which was tougher and did not depend on cultivated fields. A historical detail showing how the crisis had encouraged the rediscovery of alternative textile materials. The coarse feel of the nettle strands was the tactile imprint of a vital skill being passed on. He reflected on the domestic economy of the time. Margot had saved the bones from the animals Gauthier had slaughtered, not to discard, but to boil into a nourishing broth or grind into bone powder used to polish linen, a cycle of complete utilization made necessary by the severe cold. The mineral, neutral smell of boiled bone was the aroma of total subsistence, a human-scale story of frugality. Abbot Frédéric, preparing for the final stretch of hardship, had begun releasing rare and cold-resistant seeds from his own reserves, trusting Gautier and the other peasants to return the borrowed portion after the next harvest. The soft, dry sound of the seeds falling into Gautier's hands marked the rhythm of restored trust, a counterpoint to the silence of uncertainty that had dominated the previous months. Alban noted a historical curiosity of the period, the high infant mortality rate. He observed that babies born during the peak of the cold were far more fragile, and Margot's struggle to keep her child warm and fed was a quiet fight for the continuity of life itself. The delicate feel of the baby's soft skin was a physical reminder of human vulnerability before an unforgiving nature. Gautier had finally finished repairing the plough. Its clean frame and newly polished iron pieces were the visual embodiment of hope and the return of order. He felt the cold, solid metal in his hands, a sensation of strength and purpose. He bent toward the ground, searching for the scent of moisture, of life that the thaw promised. Brother Alban leaned into the poetic metaphor of the snow that melts and nourishes to describe the end of the ordeal. The cold, though destructive, left behind the essential moisture needed for planting, turning calamity into fertility. The sound of dripping water, steady and slow along the eaves, was the melody of promise. He thought of Abbot Frédéric, who now spent more time inspecting the abbey's irrigation channels, preparing them for the spring flow. The sound of water being redirected and organized became a rhythm of order and of future plans, a serene reflection on the management of dwindling resources. Alban organized his rolls of parchment, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers and the weight of the chronicle he had written. His work was proof that life, even under immense pressure, held fast to its story and to its dignity. He looked at the pale grey sky outside, an image of cautious hope. The small human story of Gauthier and Brother Silas, the hermit, working together on the plough, was his farewell image of the crisis. Faith and manual labour, the spiritual and the material, united to secure the harvest. The gentle sound of Silas's hammer striking the wooden beam of the plough was a rhythm of cooperation and hope. He closed the section with the warm internal sensation of quiet comfort, the heat generated by concentration and completed work. Brother Alban knew the village of Saint-Gilles was ready to face the coming spring not with euphoria, but with a calm expectation of hard labor and renewal. The air in the village of Saint-Gilles carried a quiet peace, with the cold withdrawing to the highest mountain peaks and leaving behind a moist, promising soil. Brother Alban breathed in the sweet scent of damp earth and the fresh, no longer frozen breeze that carried a faint hint of new tree buds, the first fragrance of renewal. The temperature felt gentler now, touched by a soft warmth settling in little by little, marking the end of their long ordeal. He lifted his gaze to the sky, noticing the pale blue that had replaced the stubborn grey. A serene sight, he connected to the full moon from months before, once cold and distant, now transformed into a timid, welcoming sun. Alban wrote that the fear of hunger had softened into a kind of practical gratitude, where every piece of bread and every bundle of firewood was cherished with newfound reverence. The abbey's most persistent sound was the soft, steady dripping of the thaw, a rhythmic lullaby offered by nature itself. Alban leaned into the poetic metaphor of the ice's tear to describe the end of the great famine, a silent weeping that nourished the land. The gentle scratch of his quill on parchment was the only other sound he allowed into his chronicle, a small rhythm of order within the larger calm. Abbot Frederick had begun the ritual planting of the first rye seeds, a simple ceremony held in the abbey's field. He felt the cold, damp soil beneath his knees, an earthy touch of humility and labor, and the act became a final moment of faith in both land and God. The sight of the abbot, hands covered in soil, was the portrait of a renewed leader. Gauthier, the peasant, was back in the fields, guiding the plough through a soil that, though heavy and slow to yield, still opened under the blade he had repaired. The soft, rhythmic sound of the plough cutting into the ground, an echo of hard work and restored order, became the melody of economic rebirth. He breathed in the rich, earthy scent of freshly turned soil, an aroma of life and future rising in place of ashes and despair. Margot, the weaver, had hung her dark linen in the sun, and the visual contrast between the deep fabric and the pale blue sky was a poetic reminder of the hardship they had survived. She was now weaving a lighter, finer cloth, its softer texture a symbol of quiet prosperity, a small, tangible hope. Brother Alban reflected gently on the connection between past and present. The cold and the hunger had taught the community resilience and solidarity, values he hoped would outlast the memory of scarcity. He felt the brief warmth of sunlight on his face, a comforting touch after such a long journey. He reviewed the record of Abbot Frederick's bronze scale, an object that had become a symbol of fairness. He imagined it now being used to weigh Gautier's first seeds, a poetic counterpoint tying the beginning of the crisis to its resolution. The subtle metallic ring of the scale, a rhythm of justice, marked the return of restored trust. Alban wrote into his chronicle a final message of peace. Life in Saint-Gilles had found its new rhythm, slower, more cautious, but wiser. He compared the return of the sun to the flame of a candle, small but persistent, one that never truly goes out. He closed his notebook, feeling the rough texture of the parchment and the weight of the history he had witnessed. The abbey bell rang for vespers with a deep cadence, now a rhythm of gratitude rather than urgency. Until tomorrow. I'll be here, waiting to travel with you through these forgotten ages. You already know where to find me, right here, between history and dream. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and rest well, traveler.